The Halloween Horror Nights Tribute Store is a seasonal shop located at Universal Studios Florida, premiering with every Halloween Horror Nights event since 2015. It's incredibly interesting that Universal has committed to creating such highly detailed and atmospheric retail spaces, and because they must be making a pretty significant chunk of cash from this, the tribute stores have evolved beyond just Halloween Horror Nights. They've now covered Mardi Gras and the holiday season, in addition to special stores such as Jurassic World or Universal Monsters. Every single store is unique and interesting, and I highly recommend checking out a previous video I produced that covers their history and content. However, this summer at the park, the Tribute Store has worked as a celebration of classic Universal summer blockbusters. Starting from the theater marquee facade out front, you move into the lobby and from there into a small hallway featuring movie posters. It's a detail that most people would miss, but the stripes on the walls are also painted in the same colors as the original sound stages when the park first opened. You then move into the first room themed around E.T., selling merchandise and designed to look like Elliot's room. As with all the other tribute stores, you can find various Easter eggs and references to Universal films, parks, and history in here. The next room, though, is themed to Jaws. This is probably my favorite of the rooms. You then move through a hallway and into a room that celebrates Back to the Future. The final room and checkout counters then transitions to the lobby of a theater. Most notable here is the Kong photo op, quite reminiscent of the original photo op at the end of Kongfrontation. You finally exit the store through a hallway where you can spot some interesting Easter eggs in the exit vestibule, some even referencing the Halloween Horror Nights house, Slaughter Cinema. If you've watched my two-parter video where I did a complete deep dive into the early years for this park, you'll certainly recognize that all these films have also had their own respective attractions in that early park as well. E.T. is still around, but I fondly remember Jaws, Back to the Future, and Kongfrontation, and the park has changed quite dramatically since then. Yet, if these weren't popular and well-loved, why would Universal spend the time and money to theme a whole store to them? It goes beyond just this though, because as I mentioned earlier, Universal temporarily used the space in the Mummy retail shop for a classic Universal Monsters tribute store. In spring of 2021, they also moved their main Universal merchandise retail space to a larger building, repurposing the old one as the Universal Legacy Store, themed to the early history of the parks, and of course selling merchandise based around these older attractions. The point I'm making is that Universal clearly knows that there's a market for this, and with Universal Studios Florida desperately needing some more impressive dark rides, I would like to discuss how and why the park could find a way to bring these attractions back in a spectacular way. If you're skeptical that they would bring these back, I can certainly understand, but I also think that if you allow me to really lay out why this makes sense, I can probably change your mind. While Universal Studios Hollywood added attractions over the decades and slowly evolved into a theme park based around movie production, it was always held back by still being a working studio. When Universal Studios Florida was conceptualized, it was designed as Universal's flagship theme park, taking many of the segments found on the Hollywood Tram Tour and blowing them up into full-scale attractions. Despite not being a true studio like in Hollywood, the Florida park was always intended to have a smaller degree of production going on, and the overall theme was still dedicated to movies. Its guest areas could be used as film sets, and the park was often not shy about portraying them as such, as going behind the scenes was an essential aspect of the theming. The attractions themselves, however, were marketed as riding the movies, working as immersive experiences that brought you right into Universal's impressive blockbusters. To make my point, the early park was a seemingly random assortment of themed areas, but the whole park was tied together with the movie theme, whether it being going behind the scenes or in actually being immersed into experiences based on these popular films. When Islands of Adventure opened next door, Universal knew that it wanted to incorporate iconic intellectual property, but instead went with adventure as the overall theme. It's also worth noting that the park also shared the theme of literature, and that Marvel Superhero Island, Toon Lagoon, Zeus Landing, and The Lost Continent were based in popular written and oral stories. The only exception was Jurassic Park, though it was still based on the original written material, and when the Wizarding World of Harry Potter made its way in, that principle still applied. The introduction of Skull Island Reign of Kong and the Jurassic World Velocicoaster have essentially eliminated that literature element, but the overall adventure theme is still strong and present. To me, while an overarching theme for a park isn't necessary to make it great, it's certainly something that makes the overall experience feel unified and richer. One of my largest issues with Disney is the destruction of these themes that made their parks feel so unique. Whether it be the World's Fair theme of Epcot, to the celebration of cinema at Disney's Hollywood Studios, to the tribute to California and its culture at Disney California Adventure. Like these parks, Universal Studios Florida has slowly lost its identity as the filmmaking process slowly died out, and its many classic attractions were replaced, removing the behind-the-scenes aspect that was prevalent throughout them. So, is that to say that it's completely gone? Well, certainly not, as the park's largest land of Production Central is still vaguely themed to media production, incorporating Despicable Me Minion Mayhem, Hollywood Rip Ride Rockets, and the Music Plaza stage. However, as Shrek 4D was ripped out in favor of a heavily teased Minions attraction, and it appears that the same is happening with the Monsters Cafe, the last remnants of the film production theme seem to be going away. I understand wanting to capitalize on the popularity of Minions, but if this area truly turns into a Minions Alley of sorts, then there's nothing to really tie the park together thematically. So, to fix this, I would like to propose an idea for an attraction that works as a thesis statement for the park. Something that works to celebrate cinema, bringing back the scenes from the iconic classic attractions that once defined the experience here, and working to bring back a unifying theme that allows the park experience to feel richer and more distinct. One of the greatest losses for Disney's Hollywood Studios was the Great Movie Ride. Having opened with the park in 1989 when it was known as Disney MGM Studios, it brought guests through the films that built Hollywood, treating them as reverent works of art that would inspire generations of viewers. The park contained two themes, one of which was the romanticized golden age of Hollywood, and the other was behind-the-scenes movie production, blatantly ripping off Universal's plan for Universal Studios Florida. Regardless of this being the case though, I still enjoyed this aspect of the park, even if Universal executed it better. The Great Movie Ride worked as a thesis statement that defined the park though, using that reverence for the golden age of filmmaking as a segue into more contemporary films and blockbusters, allowing the incorporation of the behind-the-scenes theme to blend in naturally. Essentially what I'm proposing is that Universal build its own version of the Great Movie Ride, but reviving many of the ideas found in early Universal Studios Florida. Clearly the merchandise is selling well, and so obviously there's a demand to experience these older properties. Before Universal built these attractions as full-blown experiences though, they originally premiered as smaller scenes on the tram tour in Universal Hollywood. The Jaws experience would premiere in 1976, bringing you up close with a fearsome great white shark. However, 10 years later, the tram tour would introduce a scene from Paramount's 1976 remake of King Kong, bringing riders up close to the rampaging monster in New York City. In 1988, the tram tour would then introduce the segment based on the 1974 film Earthquake, driving the tram through a subway station as the scene devolved into chaos. Clearly, these individual scenes work together as part of a larger experience, and so I would like to revive this idea into a ride that brings back many of these classic attractions in one form or another. However, it definitely would be a tram tour though. There was at one point a rumor concerning a trackless dark ride conceptualized by Universal, starting off in a drive-in movie theater and bringing riders right through the screens and into Universal's classic monster films. I'm not really sure how valid this rumor was, but with a whole Monsters-themed land coming to Epic Universe, I'm quite sure that the idea, if it existed, was scrapped. However, a trackless dark ride that brings you through the screen and right into various films beyond just Universal Monsters sounds like a great idea to me. A large show building could house various scenes, all lasting about a minute and being randomized, allowing for a large degree of re-rideability. Of course, Jaws would be included, and Earthquake as well. There is the question of Kong though, as the original Kongfrontation was based on a Paramount film, and Universal has clearly represented their own version with Skull Island and Islands of Adventure. Still, I think a revival of Kong terrorizing New York City would be welcome here, and if Universal could spread out the Wizarding World and potentially even Nintendo over various parks, I don't see why Kong couldn't make a second appearance. Still, this is only covering a few scenes though. Something I would like to potentially see back is Twister, throwing riders into a storm in the town of Wakita, like in the original attraction. However, to really diversify the experience, other properties could be brought back in different ways. For example, I would definitely like to see Back to the Future, but there's nothing to really pull from as the original attraction was just a simulator. However, I could definitely see Universal coming up with a creative physical scene that puts riders right into the action of the film. Another contender would be Ghostbusters, and while that was produced by Columbia Pictures, Universal definitely has a history of licensing it in their parks. Moving beyond previously established early attractions in the park though, I have a few other ideas in mind. I know that Jurassic World is represented with the Velocicoaster at Island, but I would definitely like to see a scene, like in the Ride of Beijing, with the Tyrannosaurus fighting the Indominus Rex. Maybe this is a bit of a wild card, but since Jurassic Park is already represented at Islands as well, maybe do something different, like escaping from an animatronic Spinosaurus. I know that Jurassic Park 3 was poorly received, because, no, it's not a good film, but it still would make for a great scene on this ride. I think it's also important to move away from thrilling scenes though, and so some milder films would be welcome as well. This could include a musical scene from Mamma Mia, or something relating to the Blues Brothers, especially since they're already popular entertainment. The ride could also bring you into animated films, covering DreamWorks properties like Shrek or Kung Fu Panda, as those particular IPs still seem to strongly resonate. The list could go on, covering Universal monsters that may not appear at the new park, or potentially licensing out films from other studios as well. However, I think that an attraction like this, not only bringing back iconic moments from Universal's past, but also incorporating new ones, would go over incredibly well, especially because, as I stated, there is definitely a demand for them. With that being said though, I would like to next take a look at where an attraction like this might be placed, and what it would do for the overall theme of the park. Ideally, an attraction like this would be placed in Production Central, as the area is generic enough to work for an overarching movie theme. However, there just really isn't the space for something this ambitious. Even if you tore up Minions or any of the other buildings here in the middle of the park, you would still have a really difficult time of finding the space. To the south, just past Rip Ride Rockit, you could tear out the sound stages, providing enough room for an attraction with this scale. However, these buildings are used for various houses during Halloween Horror Nights, and so the park would need to work logistical magic to keep the event at its current capacity of 10 houses. Removing the sound stages is pretty impractical, unless Universal moves the event to Epic Universe, which I actually kind of favor. As much as I enjoy Horror Nights, what I don't enjoy is the long queues of barricades and industrial back-of-house buildings. With the new park, Universal definitely has the space to build dedicated buildings and indoor queues specifically for the event. Still, I doubt that this is going to happen though, and so the sound stages are likely to stay. While Universal Studios Florida does have some smaller expansion plots, the only other feasible space for this proposed attraction would be Kid Zone. I've seen a lot of people propose an idea to bring back Universal's classic attractions in a new land at Epic Universe, but I feel that's definitely the wrong thematic choice. Instead though, Kid Zone offers a huge pot of land that could work to revive this idea. The entrance would be flanked by animal actors, which has been a staple show of classic Universal, and you would of course have the E.T. Adventure in the front as well. However, past these attractions would be that ambitious Universal movie ride, tying everything together into a land and exploring the classic blockbusters that define Universal and the original vision of this park. Realistically, do I expect Universal to build something like this? Absolutely not, but I think that if they really wanted to, the logistics of the area and the attraction makes sense. It is clear to both me and Universal that there is a demand to bring these attractions back in one form or another. A great Universal movie ride is just a fun fantasy of mine, but I think it's something that would work really well in this park, especially considering how the rest of it is oversaturated with too many screen-based 3D experiences. With this being said, I would like for people to comment and tell me how feasible they think an attraction like this would be, also throwing in your own ideas for movies you would like to see. You can also do me a favor and leave a like on the video, but sharing it around as well might drum up some support for something like this. Something that Universal seems to really like doing is appealing to nostalgia, so if you get this idea on their radar, there's always that ever so slim chance that it may become a reality. Finally, you can also hit the subscribe button with bell notification, so as to know when new videos are published.